Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem, ayadadai, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. Blessed is the Holy One. What a great day to be together and learning some Torah. That was the band Pumbedisa, and you'll know a little later in the show why it was important to start with a song from Pumbedisa. And that was Pumbedisa singing with Matt Dubb and Zusha. How you doing, my holy sisters and brothers? We've got a really special show today. We're gonna do a little bit of the teaching from today's daf, and then we're gonna run into Rav Yosef and understand a little bit about his character, and then do a deep dive on the great sage Rav Yosef. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this lovely Thursday evening? Let's see, let me get to the beginning there. Yehudit from Florence, South Carolina. James from Indianapolis. Melissa from Great Neck. Grace says shalom. Brandon from Knoxville. This is your first time joining us. Make sure to let us know so we can welcome you. Tom from Pennsylvania. Patrice from St. George. Maria says shalom and cool music. Bill says shalom. Where'd it go? That skipped. Pam says shalom from Nashville. Augusto Martin says Led Zeppelin next time, please. Carmen is with us from Portland, and Portland is not burning to the ground, thank God. Fred says you are live. Chaim is with us from Charlotte. Andressa says shalom from Brazil, and Fred is with us from Pomona. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you with us. And Lynn on the YouTube side is with us from North Texas. All right, we got a lot to do here. Let's get into it. Where are we holding? We are in chapter 6 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're still discussing the first Mishna of chapter 6, and we are on Daf Samech Vav, that's page 66 of Tractate Eruvin. The basic principle that we've been discussing is that all of the residences, right, all of the houses that share a courtyard have to join in an Eruv, or none of the people who live in that courtyard are going to be able to carry objects in the courtyard or in and out of their house to the courtyard. And this is because the courtyard takes on a semi-public characteristic, since multiple people have rights in that courtyard. So even though it's private property for sure, it belongs to the residents of the courtyard because they live in separate homes and have they sort of share rights in that courtyard. For them to be able to carry in the courtyard on Shabbos, they have to establish an Eruv together. Everybody deposits a little bit of food into, let's say, a basket, and they keep that basket of food in one of the homes in the courtyard. That was the law ever since King Solomon established that houses sharing a courtyard would require an Eruv in King Solomon's time. Okay, we also learn that if we have a situation where one courtyard depends on another, as we saw in this situation where the people who live in this inner courtyard have to pass through the outer courtyard in order to get to the street, then they have to establish an Eruv with the people who live in this courtyard, the two courtyards together, so that carrying is going to be permitted there. Otherwise, if they establish an Eruv for themselves, but not with this people, this guy is going to be restricted. He's going to be prohibited to carry in his own courtyard, even though he lives alone in that courtyard, because these people do have a right, an easement to pass through his courtyard in order to get to the street. They have no other way to reach the street than through that courtyard, and so they have to join in the Eruv together. Let's see. But if you have a situation like this, where you have two courtyards that open into each other, so they have the possibility of creating an Eruv together, but they each have their own independent entrances to the alley, so then they don't have to join in an Eruv. They can make separate Eruvs if they want to. Neither courtyard restricts the other. So if they form an Eruv for themselves, that Eruv is going to be valid. If these people don't form an Eruv, it's going to be an independent situation between the two courtyards. Okay. And we also saw that if they indeed want to make a joint Eruv between the two courtyards, which would be nice. I mean, probably these people all know each other very well. And on Shabbos, one of them might want to carry a little bit of food from his house in this courtyard over to his friend's house in that courtyard. And to be able to carry between the courtyards, they need a joint Eruv. If the houses in this courtyard establish an Eruv for themselves and the houses in this courtyard establish an Eruv for themselves, they don't all have to deposit food in that communal Eruv for the two courtyards. One of the residents of either of the courtyards can represent the other residents of his courtyard and establish the bigger Eruv. And of course, that's one of the principles that makes community, neighborhood Eruvs work here in modern times. It's not that every house of a Jew, or at least even an observant Jew who would care about this, in LA has personally deposited food that's being used for the big community Eruv, which covers many square miles in Los Angeles, but rather certain people can act as representatives on behalf of everyone else, because everyone who's inside the Eruv benefits from it. Nobody is harmed by being part of the Eruv. And so the sages decreed that people can represent others, even without their knowledge, to join in an Eruv. And then everybody who's in a part of that communal joint Eruv, joining the courtyards together, will benefit from it. Now, where you have a situation that is complicated, as we saw yesterday, right, is where this is a Jew, this is a Jew, this is a Gentile. Right, so the Gentile can't join in the Eruv because the Gentile is not restricted on Shabbos. He can carry or not carry as he wishes. He is not bound by the laws of Shabbos. He's not a Jew. But if he shares a courtyard with a Jew, if there's only one Jew and one Gentile, the sages did not decree for that situation. It's as if the Jew lives alone because the other person he shares a courtyard with isn't bound by the laws of Shabbos. But where two Jews would need to form an Eruv in order to be able to carry, as they would here with the dependent courtyard that passes through here, these guys need to make an Eruv with each other. And once two Jews are making an Eruv, if there's a Gentile who shares that space with them, so then they need to rent his right to carry from him. You know, he doesn't lose anything. He doesn't care about the Jew's right to carry, but they need to enter into a formal arrangement with him. The question is, for sure you can do that before Shabbos, and basically say, we need to, it's just it's a formality. You lose nothing. It just allows us to carry on Shabbos. We'll give you a token sum like a penny, but the penny has to change hands. And then we're going to be permitted to carry on Shabbos. It really benefits us a lot. It doesn't hurt you at all. Will you do that with us? They have to ask him. So that's the principle that we have been studying. Then the question comes up, well, what if the Gentile who lives here was away during the week and he arrives on Shabbos and they never established, at any other time with him? They don't have to keep doing this every week. They can establish it from now on. But they never did establish with him. And then he comes home on Shabbos. So now they didn't rent his rights because they didn't even know he was around. He was absent. He was an absentee landlord. Maybe he's been away traveling for years. But he arrives home on Shabbos and they didn't make this arrangement before Shabbos. So can they make an arrangement with him to rent his rights, as it were, so that they can carry? Can they do that on Shabbos is the question. Certainly they can't touch money and make a financial exchange on Shabbos. Money is muktzah on Shabbos. But could they just say to him, well, this is our situation and we would need to rent the rights from you. If you agree to do that, we'll give you the penny after Shabbos. Is it okay with you that we do this? So the question is, can they do that? Can they rent the rights from the Gentile who shares the courtyard with them on Shabbos itself? Rabbi Yochanan said, yes, we can rent the rights of a Gentile even on Shabbos. And this is similar to the law that if you have, for example, let's talk about this courtyard here, and these are both Jews. right? And let's even to make it simpler or more direct to this point, let's say that in this courtyard here, there are 4 houses, right? There are 4 houses, and let's say that the owner of these 3 houses put food in the basket to make the Erev, and the guy in the 4th house agreed to do it. He was going to do it, and he meant to do it, but on Friday he got really busy and things went crazy, and he never got around to putting a little bit of food in the Erev that would establish the Erev for this courtyard. Now they've got one guy who didn't join in the Erev, but who has rights in that courtyard. He will restrict everybody from carrying on Shabbos. What can they do? On Shabbos, he does have the option of renouncing his right. He can renounce his right. It's called bitul reshus. He can renounce his right to carry in the courtyard, and he can do that on Shabbos. So he won't be able to carry on Shabbos because he didn't join in the Erev, but everybody else will, because there won't be anybody who has rights in their courtyard and that didn't participate in the Erev, since he renounced his rights, and he can do that even on Shabbos. It is a kind of financial transaction, as it were. It's a transaction of some sort, and you might think that that's not permitted on Shabbos, but it is, because it's only for the purpose of the mitzvah. What mitzvah? So that everybody else can have more enjoyment on Shabbos. They can carry things in and out of their houses. They want to have lunch at one guy's house and says, oh, I have some wine at my house. Let's drink it at your lunch. He can go home, get the wine out of his house, carry it through the courtyard, and bring it over to the house where everybody's having lunch. So there's definitely, increases the possibility of delighting in Shabbos, which is certainly a mitzvah. So Rabbi Yochanan says, with respect to the Gentile in that situation, he cannot renounce his rights because he doesn't have rights, as it were, to join in an Erev, but he does live in that courtyard, so we need to rent his rights, as it were. And that can be done on Shabbos, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Elazar wondered at this ruling. He said, is that right? And that was recorded in the Talmud. Rabbi Elazar said, is that right? I have a problem with that. And it didn't say what Rabbi Elazar's problem was with the ruling. It just said that he wondered at it. People noticed that he was uncomfortable with it. But then they figured out, somebody else commented what it was. It's that Rabbi Elazar was a student of Shmuel. Shmuel had a ruling which contradicts this teaching, this ruling of Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel held that we may not renounce our rights on Shabbos in a place where we don't restrict each other or where we may not establish an Erev together. Okay, so if we go back to this situation, so what Shmuel said was, you can only renounce your rights, right, if 2 conditions are present. One is that the person who's renouncing would otherwise restrict the other people. And second, that they can form an Erev together, right? So here, for sure, just in terms of the Erev for this courtyard, this person, if he didn't participate in the Erev, he would restrict all the other houses in his courtyard from carrying. And of course, they can enter into an Erev together. So in that situation, a person can renounce his rights on Shabbos. However, if the issue was that everyone wanted to join in a joint Erev between the 2 courtyards here, and that was the plan, that everybody was going to do that, but this guy forgot. They certainly can join in a communal Erev for the 2 courtyards, but the fact that this courtyard, for example, did not complete its Erev does not restrict this courtyard. They're independent. Why? Because they don't have to walk through each other's courtyard in order to get to the alley. They both have entrances to the alley. And so both conditions are not met. And in that situation, says Shmuel, he would not be able to renounce his rights so that a big communal Erev could be created. That would not be possible on Shabbos, according to Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan would say that is possible, but Shmuel would not. And then what follows is going to be a long discussion. Even though everyone acknowledges that the law follows Rabbi Yochanan, they're going to do a long discussion trying to understand Shmuel's position. Even though they know it's not the law, they're going to do a deep dive on Shmuel. So Shmuel, okay, so the two examples that I just gave you, see, in this situation, all right, where there's an inner and an outer, and the two courtyards restrict each other, okay, so if this was a Jew and a Jew and a Jew, so then the two courtyards would need to make an Eruv together, or they would be restricted, and they can make an Eruv together, so if one forgot to join, he could renounce his rights on Shabbos. But where you have this Gentile present, so he cannot join in the Eruv, right? We have to rent out his rights, but we need to do that before Shabbos. If he arrives on Shabbos, the question is, can we rent out his rights on Shabbos? And according to Shmuel, no, we cannot. According to Rabbi Yochanan, yes, we can. Okay, so that's the discussion. That's the basic discussion that's going on our page. But at a certain point in the discussion, Rav Yosef is quoted. He enters the discussion and he says, I have not heard this halacha of Shmuel. I have not heard this ruling of Shmuel. And his disciple, Abaye, says to Rav Yosef, you told it to us. And with respect to this, you said that there is no renouncing of rights from one courtyard to another, right? You can renounce your rights in your own courtyard, but you cannot renounce your rights in somebody else's courtyard. But you said this only applies in this situation where the two courtyards are independent of each other, but where the two courtyards are dependent on each other, right? There's an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. There you can renounce your rights in the other courtyard to make it work for everybody. And then, so Abaye reminds Rav Yosef that he taught this law. So the question is, why did Rav Yosef forget an important law that he himself taught? And we're going to understand that soon. So Rav Yosef then says to Abaye, well, wait a minute. Isn't it that we read the Mishna precisely, and the Mishna says that the residents of a courtyard may renounce their rights? It doesn't say that the residents of courtyards, plural, right? The residents of a single courtyard can renounce their rights. The Mishnah doesn't say that the residents of multiple courtyards can renounce their rights. Isn't that how we learn that these two can't renounce their rights in the other courtyard? And it's not with regard to whether one courtyard is dependent on the other or not? And Abaye says, no, when you said that we have to read the Mishnah precisely, and that it says the residents of a single courtyard, it doesn't say the residents of courtyards, plural. You said that what we learn from that is that the relationship of courtyards to an alley is similar to the relationship of houses to courtyard. In other words, if you're going to join, like if you have this situation, right, where two, and it would be like this. So, right, so now we have two courtyards opening into an alley, and then this is how we started Tractate Eruvin. What's going to make it possible to carry in the alley on Shabbos? First of all, that the two courtyards have to join in an Eruv together, and then they have to make either a side post at the entrance of the alley, because this out here is the public thoroughfare, right? Like that. And so they would have to make either a side post or a cross beam, over at the entrance of the alley. But this is only going to work if the courtyards each have multiple houses in them, meaning that they each have an Eruv. So if there was only one house in one of the courtyards, this wouldn't count as a courtyard with an Eruv, and therefore there would only be one courtyard opening into the alley, and then it wouldn't work. So they couldn't actually make an adjustment so that they could carry in the alley. And that is what Rav Yosef taught Abaye, is the lesson that we learn from the precise wording of the Mishnah, that the residents of a Courtyard can renounce their rights, not the residents of Courtyards. Let me get back into my notes. Okay. So, why is it that the master taught this lesson, taught it well, so that his disciple learned it very precisely and was able to transmit that teaching onto his students, but then the master himself forgot it and had to relearn it from his student? Who was Rav Yosef and why did he forget? So let's meet the Mensch and do a deep dive on Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef, I hope you're with me. It's really fun to learn about the sages, to learn a little bit about their life story, their biography. And Rav Yosef was a wonderful, wonderful person and a great character. So Rav Yosef was a third generation Amora in Bavel, right? So the Amoraim, that's plural of Amora, are the rabbis, the sages, who are teaching primarily in Bavel, in Babylonia, though there were some in Israel as well, in Eretz Israel. It was no longer the kingdom of Israel. It was a region, a province of Rome, as it were. Rome had taken over the Holy Land at this time, and that's why there was really more activity, more Torah learning, bigger and more productive Torah academies in Babylonia by this time than there were in the land of Israel. But the sages that lived before the Mishna was compiled in about the year 200, those are called Tanaim, or a singular Tana. And then the later sages of the Talmud itself, who were active in the period between when the Mishnah was compiled in 200 until the Talmud, the Gemara, was compiled, some say in the year 500, some say around the year 600. So they were active in that period there. Okay. So he's a third generation Amora over on the Babylonian side. He's based in Pumbedisa. That's why I wanted to play music from Pumbedisa earlier. And Pumbedisa, along with Nehardea and Surah, were three of the big centers of Torah learning in Bavel, in Babylonia, which at that time, and by the way, is not the Babylonian Empire anymore. It's part of the Persian Empire. So he's based in Pumbedisa. His teacher was Rav Yehuda. We often hear statements of Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yosef was a student of Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda was a student of Rav and Shmuel. So and they are the ones who really opened the period of the Talmud. Rav is a kind of a bridge to the Tanaim and the period of the Mishnah. So Rav and Shmuel was kind of the beginning of that tradition in Babylonia. And then their primary student was Rav Yehuda. And Rav Yehuda, his primary students were Rav Yosef and Rabbah. Rav Yosef and Rabbah were dear friends and colleagues. And we very often hear throughout the Talmud that they were discussing a law, and Rabbah says this, and Rav Yosef says that, and they disagree. And then pretty much always the law follows Rabbah, although where there are some important exceptions where the law follows Rav Yosef. But there's no less than 38 instances where it says Rabbah and Rav Yosef both say. And when it says Rabbah and Rav Yosef both say, so then for sure the law is like that, because they're the two biggest sages of their generation, and when they agree, it's solid as solid can be. When Rav Yehuda died, both Rabbah and Rav Yosef were considered for the position of Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Torah Academy in Pumbedisa. And then the question came up, okay, so who should get the job? Who should become the greatest sage of the generation, right? It was Rav Yehuda. He passed away. They honored him very much. And then it was time to appoint a new head of the academy. Now, Rabbah and Rav Yosef had different approaches or different skills, let's say, that they brought to bear on Torah learning. And they had nicknames. Rabbah was known as one who uproots mountains. And Rav Yosef was known as Sinai. What does that mean? To uproot mountains, the reason Rabbah was called that is because his keen intellect. He was so sharp. His logical reasoning, his ability to deduct principles from other principles was so sharp that from time to time, he would take a law that had been established for a long time and show that everybody had been misunderstanding it for a long time. And they could follow his logic, and he could actually uproot mountains of precedent with his sharp reasoning. Rav Yosef was known as Sinai because basically imagine he had a photographic memory. His memory was so immense, his encyclopedic knowledge of the tradition was so great that if you wanted to know, what any sage held on any matter in the whole tradition up until that time, go see Rav Yosef and he'll know. He just knew what everyone said, how they said it, when they said it, how they worded it, the precise wording of the Mishnas and the Baraisas and the Toseftas. I mean, he was just an incredible mind who could bring all of that knowledge and carry it around with him. So the sages were said, so who should we appoint to be the head of the academy? The uprooter of mountains or Sinai? So they actually they couldn't decide, so they sent the question to Eretz Yisrael. They sent the question to the sages who were based in the land of Israel. And the answer came back. It probably took weeks or months to get the answer back. And it came back and they said, you should appoint Sinai. You might think that the guy with the really big brain who could, understand with logical reasoning how to uproot mountains and sort of break everything down and build it back up again would be the better head of the academy. But actually, the guy who holds the entire tradition at his fingertips is better for a Torah academy because this was an oral tradition. Very little of it was ever written down. So the guy who could just remember what everyone had said and how they said it and how they ruled and why they ruled that way is considered greater. And so therefore they offered the position of the head of the academy to Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef turned them down. He said that he had been told by astrologers, he had been forewarned that if he took the job, he would only be the head of the academy for 2 years, and then he would die. And that was scary enough to him. I mean, it's scary enough to anyone. But Rav Yosef was so pious, that for him, to have any years taken away from his life meant that those were years in which he was not going to learn or teach Torah or fulfill his obligations as a Jew and do mitzvahs. So it wasn't even so much that he was afraid of death because he knows he's going to the world to come. It's not so much fear of death. It's that he feared losing years of his life that could be so productive. And so he said, no, I can't take that chance. Give the job to Rabbah. Okay. So they gave the job to Rabbah, his close friend, colleague, collaborator. I mean, they're really just so tight, these two guys. They argue with each other. They bring different points of view, but they very much love each other. Now, Rabbah gets elevated over Rav Yosef. And so as before, they were just friends and colleagues. Now, Rabbah is in the position of the master and Rav Yosef in the position of the disciple. Some people, who are friends and suddenly one of them becomes the boss, have difficulty with that. Rav Yosef, never. He was such a humble person that he never took airs upon himself. He never, because he was so prominent and renowned in Pumbedisa, he could have easily had things delivered to his house rather than go run errands himself. No, he did it himself. He never, wanted people to stand up when he walked in the room the way that they would for Rabbah. And in fact, he himself took to calling Rabbah master when they were in public places. I mean, they're good friends. He doesn't do that when it's private. But in any kind of a public setting, he would defer to Rabbah and refer to him as master. That's great humility, a lesson in humility. In terms of that encyclopedic knowledge, it's like borne out in the Talmud where 46 different times we hear something written out as Rav Yosef taught a baraisa. Very often it says, a baraisa states, or somebody brought a baraisa. But when it says Rav Yosef taught a baraisa, it means that baraisa is being transmitted perfectly and we can rely on it. Rav Yosef also had tremendous knowledge. That encyclopedic knowledge of his included knowledge of the Targum. So the Targum was the first translation of the Torah. What language was it translated into? Aramaic. Aramaic was the sort of lingua franca, the common language of the region. And it was translated by Onkelos, right? So Onkelos was a great sage who actually was a non-Jew who converted to Judaism and created, one of the greatest and most important translations of the Torah in history into Aramaic. And often Rav Yosef would say that if we didn't have Onkelos's translation, the Targum, we might not understand the Torah as well as we do. Likewise, there was a translation made of the books of the prophets by Yonasan ben Uziel and into Aramaic, and Rav Yosef knew that by heart, right? So he knew all these things by heart, all the Mishnas, all the teachings of other sages in the generations before him, the entire Torah in Hebrew, the entire Torah in Aramaic, all the books of the prophets in Hebrew, all the books of the prophets in Aramaic. Memorized. Now, one reason that he may have been so capable as a memorizer of all that knowledge, memorized, word perfect, possible that the reason he was able to do that is because he was unable to write anything down. Why was Rav Yosef unable to write anything down? Because he was blind. I haven't even mentioned that up until now. The art scroll in this wonderful, wonderful compilation, the Introduction to the Talmud, which I really highly recommend, and it has all these biographies of the sages, also doesn't mention the fact that Rav Yosef is blind until, we've been learning all these other details that I've shared with you. And then suddenly you hear, and even later in the discussion, that he's blind. And it's like, don't you think you'd want to mention that earlier on? But it just, it just didn't really enter into his ability to learn and to teach and to transmit and to administrate and to be part of these incredibly high-level discussions. But yeah, he was blind. And in a moment, we'll talk a little bit about how he felt about his own blindness. We'll come to that in a moment. But first, let's get some words of Rav Yosef, some of the more famous sayings of Rav Yosef. He said that, when the practical halacha, the law, is uncertain, right? When sages are debating what the law holds that people should do, not just sort of theoretical halachas, for example, talking about how the priests should serve in the temple and they're living hundreds of years after the temple has been destroyed. That's not a practical halacha. But when you're talking about whether people can, move the Shabbos lights on Shabbos or not, that's not an example for this teaching right here. But when they're talking about how people should behave in general and they're unsure of what to, how they should rule, Rav Yosef said, well, why don't you go out and see what the people are doing? And we're probably going to learn from that because this law has been established for a long time. And if the people haven't established practice, before we rule differently, we need to know that this is an established activity, an established policy among the people. He also said, there is always room in the stomach for a tasty dish. That's that's later in this tractate, Eruvin, on page 82. He also said, very famous saying, according to the strength of the camel, so is the load. That can be applied in a lot of different situations. According to the strength of the camel, so is the load. It's often said these days, God would not give you a burden that you were unable to bear, right? So he was referring to giving charity. Right? The rich people should give more. Right? According to the camel, so is the load. So, the rich people who are going through life with a tremendous amount of possessions, so they should give more in charity to the poor. But it can be applied to a lot more things as well. According to the camel, so is the load. If life saddles you with great difficulties, great challenges, okay, it's because God made you a strong enough camel to bear such a load. Rav Yosef was so humble and unassuming. So when he heard a teaching that impressed him, he would say to the person, "How excellent is this teaching?" Right? Very often the sages, everybody does this, right? You hear something that's very wise and beautiful, and it stimulates you. So either you want to argue with it because you disagree and you have another view, or, it stimulates you and you want to sort of follow up with your own idea. But we should learn from Rav Yosef and start with the compliment, right? And when we hear something beautiful and deep, give the compliment first before, sometimes I feel like, well, I want to show the guy how much I've been listening to him and appreciated what he's saying by sort of continuing the discussion with him after, he gives a lecture, and at the end of the lecture, I want to go up and ask him a question and just show him that I've been listening and sort of take the discussion in another place. Very nice thing to do. But first, tell him how excellent his teaching is. Give the compliment. When Rav Yosef, who was obviously a Torah giant, heard somebody in his presence teach a mistake, like when somebody made a mistake and taught the law wrong, right? So he would, instead of saying, "You're wrong," he would say, "May the Almighty forgive him for saying that." He would start with a prayer, right? Because he doesn't want, the worst thing that can happen in an oral tradition is that the law gets transmitted in error, right? With an error in it. So the first thing he would say is, "May the Almighty forgive him for saying that way, and here's why." And finally, in his great humility, even though he was wealthy, he was prominent, he was super respected, he was Rabba's colleague. Rabba was the head of the academy and therefore the most prominent person in Pumbedisa. Rav Yosef was number 2 and such a close second that he could have had all the honor in the world and he never would have had to do any work for himself. But he liked to participate in Shabbos preparations, and he would actually chop the wood himself, right? So that there would be a fire with the fuel for the cooking of the Shabbos meal. He wanted to personally, with his hands, participate in Shabbos preparations. He also was well known for making a feast every year at Shavuos, on the holiday of Shavuos, in the summer, so that when we celebrate the giving of the Torah, it's one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. And it was sort of his holiday. Sages often had like their big holiday, their thing. And Rav Yosef's thing was Shavuos. So on Shavuos, he would make a big feast for all the Torah scholars and all the students, all the disciples. And he would, spend a lot of money to feed all the people who were studying Torah. They should celebrate and they should have pleasure and they should eat very good meat and very good foods. And he said, "You know what? The only reason I have any merit at all in my life is because I make this feast for the other Torah scholars." Right? Totally putting aside the fact that he's a Torah giant. His mind, his teaching, he's a giant. But he says, no, the only reason I have any merit in this world and I'm different from any other Yosef that you might meet in the marketplace is because I make this yearly feast for the other Torah scholars. What a humble person. Okay, so his students, his primary students, meaning, so Rabbah and Rav Yosef were the 2 greatest scholars in their generation. The next pair were their students, and that was Abaye and Rava. Not Rabbah, but Rava. Right? So Abaye and Rava were his students, were Rav Yosef's students. And Abaye in particular came to be, over time, extremely dedicated to Rav Yosef. I mean, it was such a loving relationship of disciple to teacher. And Abaye, when he would see Rav Yosef's donkey approaching, like if the donkey's ear came around the corner before he even saw that Rav Yosef was riding it, as soon as he saw the ear of the donkey, he would, jump up in his seat to pay respect to Rav Yosef. Even though, of course, Rav Yosef was blind. And so Rav Yosef wouldn't see him pop up. So what? He wanted to do any honor that he could to Rav Yosef. And that became very, very important when Rav Yosef had an illness later in his life. And it caused him to forget much of his learning. It's unclear what the illness was. Maybe it's some kind of dementia. Maybe it's just some kind of memory loss associated with aging or with one of the illnesses associated with aging. At any rate, he lost, what he was known for, right, was that encyclopedic memory, to have the whole tradition at his fingertips. And he lost a lot of it. Not all of it. It's not like he, suddenly was an imbecile who didn't know anything, but he lost so much of that encyclopedic knowledge, that Sinai that he was carrying around in his head. But by then, thank God, he had taught everything he knew to Abaye. And Abaye also had a towering intellect and could retain what he learned. And so when Rav Yosef would make a mistake, or when he would stumble and not be sure of what he was teaching or how he once taught it, Abaye would step in and with the greatest respect and tact would remind Rav Yosef, well, you taught it to us like this, or you taught it to us like that. And this is what you said were the reasons why this is like this, or this is like that. Now, regarding his blindness, Rav Yosef said that his teacher, Rav Yehuda, had said that one who is blind is not obligated in mitzvahs. Now, that's not the halacha. A blind person is obligated. A deaf mute is not, for different reasons that is a discussion for another day, at least in ancient times. Today, obviously, we have communication tools that might render that law questionable. But even then, back then, a blind person was obligated. Now, Rav Yehuda said a blind person is not obligated, and Rav Yehuda was Rav Yosef's teacher. So Rav Yosef, aware that this had not been established as the law, would say, well, if anyone can establish that Rav Yehuda's statement that a blind person is not obligated in the mitzvahs, in the Torah obligations, if they can establish that that's the law, I'll make a holiday for all the Torah scholars, because I would like it to be the law that blind people are not obligated, and therefore all of the mitzvahs that I have fulfilled, all the obligations that I fulfill constantly, I will get greater merit for them in the world to come because I wasn't even obligated to do it. And he said that a bunch of times. But then one day he realized, wait a minute, maybe somebody shared this teaching with him or he realized it himself, I'm not sure. But then he realized, whoa. Actually, a person gets more merit for performing something that is an obligation than for performing of something that is voluntary. That's counterintuitive. You would think, well, anything that people have to do, why should they get a lot of credit for doing it? As opposed to when they go above and beyond the call of duty, we should give them a lot of credit for that. But, says Rav Yosef, it's not that way. Because the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, rises up with great power and strength to challenge us when we're trying to fulfill our obligations. So, for example, a Jewish man is obligated to pray 3 times a day, right? And, and not 4 times a day. So he doesn't really get credit if he prays a 4th time. It's nothing. But it's hard to pray 3 times a day. So often you're busy. The afternoon is winding down. You got work to do. You got people coming to see you. This one is calling. That's calling. And you barely scratch out 5 minutes for the afternoon prayer so that you can fulfill your obligation. But that's actually very worthy because the Yetzer Hara was so strong, saying to you, forget it, you can make it up later, it's not that important, you're going to rush through it anyway, what difference does it make? And all that rationalization. And so when one fulfills things that he's obligated to do, he gets more merit. And so once he learned that, Rav Yosef would say, oh, if anyone can establish that Rav Yehuda was right, that he was wrong, and that the law is, now I'm confused, but he wanted it to be that he's obligated, right? So he wanted people to establish that Rav Yehuda is wrong and that a blind person is obligated, which actually is the law, then he would make a holiday for them. So he was happy to realize that his teacher was wrong, but that he had been, all the mitzvahs that he was doing and everything that he did, all the teaching and the praying, etc., he was obligated to do, even though he was blind. Okay. So regarding when he lost his learning, right? So he lost much of what he had learned and he forgot so much of it, and Abaye would help him, as he does in our daf today. Regarding a person who lost his learning, through no fault of his own. In other words, like somebody suffering from memory loss. Regarding such a person, Rav Yosef taught it is very important to honor that person in the same way you would honor him if he had retained all of his learning. And how do we know that? Because the Ark of the Covenant contained 2 sets of tablets. The second tablets that Moses, after Moses smashed the first set of tablets with the 10 Commandments, because the people were dancing around the golden calf, and then he went back up to the top of Mount Sinai and was with God. And this time he himself carved out the tablets, and God inscribed the words of the 10 Commandments on them, unlike the first set of tablets, which God both inscribed and carved. So the 10 Commandments on their tablets that survived were stored in the Ark of the Covenant, and so were the smashed first set of tablets. And just as we honor those broken tablets, so we honor a person who was once great in learning or whatever they did in this world, and as they got older and maybe they forgot who they were, they suffer from dementia, whatever has happened to them, we honor them as if their learning was intact. And we learn that from the fact that we store the broken first set of tablets of the 10 Commandments in the Ark of the Covenant. Well, when his dear friend Rabbah died, after leading the academy, after being the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Torah Academy in Pumbedisa for 20 years, then finally Rav Yosef served in that position. And just as the astrologers had predicted, he would only be the head of the academy for 2 years, and then he died also. At that point, he was more than 80 years old. But he did finally become the Rosh Yeshiva in his lifetime. And even though he only served for 2 years, and he had already suffered from all those memory issues, this is why I say I'm not sure if it's dementia, because it's like he lost a lot of his learning, but was still fully capable of running a Torah academy, and not just running it. It wasn't like a figurehead position. He did an amazing job and was able to actually reconcile certain questions of law that had remained unreconciled during the 2 decades that Rabbah was the Rosh Yeshiva. When Rav Yosef stepped up, he was able to figure out exactly what was at issue and solve it, and so contributed to the Torah learning of that community for all time. After Rav Yosef died, his student Abaye became the Rosh Yeshiva. And the one thing I didn't mention before is that earlier in his life, when he was younger, Rav Yosef underwent 40 fasts. Can you imagine? He fasted for 40 days, not 40 days in a row, but I think when they would do this, it'd be like they'd fast on Monday and Thursday for 40 Mondays and Thursdays, right? Why? And then, because after the 40th fast, a verse was read to him by a voice from heaven, which said, "My words shall not be withdrawn from your mouth," that his Torah would remain with him. So that's why even though he lost some of his Torah later in his life, it wasn't a permanent loss. It's like he got it back. Then he did another 40 fasts. And then the next verse, this is from Isaiah, which follows, "After my words shall not be withdrawn from your mouth." The next verse is, "My words shall not be withdrawn from your mouth, nor the mouth of your offspring." And then he fasted another 40 times. And then the third verse was read to him from the book of Isaiah, "My words shall not be withdrawn from your mouth, nor from the mouth of your offspring, nor from the mouth of the offspring of your offspring." And then he said, and that's enough fasting. And so what he was fasting for, what he was praying for so fervently, is not only that he would be a sage, that he would be a Torah scholar, but that his children would be Torah scholars, and that their children would be Torah scholars. And that fervent prayer, which he was told it would be answered, it was answered. And so Rav Yosef's son was the great Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman's son was the great Rav Dimi. And so he was able to not only be a great sage in his life, Rav Yosef, but also to transmit that value to his children and to his grandchildren. So that's what I have for us today. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Rav Yosef. We haven't done a Meet the Mensch class in quite a while, but over the coming 7, we're getting in January. We'll complete our first year with God's help, but then we'll have 6.5 more years to go. So we basically have about 7 years to go. Still a little less than 7 years to go. And over this time, I hope to do many Meet the Mensch classes so that we can get to know the sages as we sort of roll along through our teaching and learning. And then now, we've done Rabbi Zera, we've done Rabbi Yochanan, I forget who else we've done right now, but now we've done Rav Yosef. And so when you hear these names, I think we did Rabbi Akiva. So when you hear these names, they should mean something to you. It's not just somebody ruling something. It's a real person who lived, who had such a tremendous impact on others, his piety, his learning, his menschlichkeit. He was just such a mensch, a person of great character and kindness, who made it his value and his business to transmit Torah as faithfully as he could from the previous generations to the later generations. All right, my friends, let me see about your comments and questions. I have to scan because Nina has another obligation, so give me a moment. Let me see if we have comments or questions. Bill says, less even than a province, the land that corresponded to Israel was an annex to the larger and wealthier imperial province of Syria, so that they had to pay taxes twice, once to the emperor and once to the governor. Charming people, the Romans. I couldn't say it any better. Well done, Bill. Zach Plotzker, great to see you with us today. Shabbat shalom to you. Okay, and Bill says, what a beautiful teaching about the smashed tablets. As someone dealing with a dear loved one who is suffering from memory loss, it gives me heart and comfort. And me too. Bill, as I've shared before at other times, my mom has pretty advanced dementia, and it's been so hard on the family, and especially on my dad. And I used to talk to my mom every day. I mean, I just love her so much, and it's become even worse during COVID, right? Where they wouldn't even let my father, who's visiting her every day, until COVID happened, and then they wouldn't let anyone visit anybody in the memory care facility, and it's just been a disaster. But yes, any honor that we can give to those who have lost some of their capacity, we give. Janice says, thanks, Salanita, for this great class. You're so very welcome. And let me just check over here. And Lynn asked earlier about leasing rights on Sabbath. It's so confusing. And with a payment, is money not muktzah? Absolutely. But you can make an arrangement where you're going to lease the rights of the Gentile. You're gonna make an arrangement, and we're gonna exchange that penny after Shabbos, right? Because you would not touch money on Shabbos. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. May we all be blessed to grow in wisdom every day and to share that wisdom. I'm an accidental Talmudist. I stumbled into this. You stumbled into this page and this class. So if you've learned something that you consider valuable and beautiful, so now it's on you. Pass it on to somebody who will appreciate that learning. Sending you all the best, my holy sisters and brothers.